Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. George Zimmerman has just been acquitted. Some people are outraged by that. Some people are absolutely delighted. Is there anything we can learn from the outrage and from the delight? Absolutely. You and I are not the rational creatures we think. We are not the rational creatures we would like to be. Whether you cheered for Zimmerman's exoneration or you were horrified that he is not being punished in some appalling way, depends entirely on irrational forces. It depends on two outrageous irrationalities. One is absolute, profound, and basic racism. And whether you think you've got it or not, you've got it. Believe me. The other is, let's call it dogmatic prejudice. Those who are white often cheered because Zimmerman was exonerated, and Zimmerman is more or less sort of white. He's Hispanic, he's swarthy, but he's whiter than he is dark. Those who are outraged and who are black are horrified because of racism, because to them, any exoneration of this white man killing a black man means exoneration of the right of whites to kill blacks, which would be an outrageous proposition. Absolutely outrageous. Those who are white, who are horrified that George Zimmerman was exonerated, are horrified because they live within an ideology that dictates how they must think. It doesn't help them think. It stops them from thinking. It tells them what they must feel. And it says that anything that goes for a white man is bad. Anything that goes for a black man is good. This is not thinking. The real thinking propositions from the George Zimmerman case are these. First of all, is George Zimmerman guilty or not? Well, he's obviously guilty of killing somebody with a gun. But did he kill that person in self-defense? Did he bang his own head against a sidewalk in order to make himself look like the victim? Did he bloody his own nose in order to make himself look like the victim? Or did Trayvon Martin bang his head against the sidewalk and bloody his nose? Frankly, I think that everything said on both sides of the case was more or less correct. George Zimmerman was trailing Trayvon Martin. George Zimmerman had been upset by a series of robberies in the neighborhood. George Zimmerman had been upset because in one case he thought he had pinned down some kids who had robbed somebody. By the way, there was also a shooting in the neighborhood. And they got away before the police arrived. George Zimmerman did continue to track Trayvon Martin, even when he was told by the 911 dispatcher not to. George Zimmerman was carrying a gun. We'll get to that later. But in all probability, Trayvon Martin did have an opportunity to walk away. And Trayvon Martin probably did decide not to, and probably did decide to turn around, and probably did get into a confrontation with George Zimmerman. And because he was much bigger than George Zimmerman was, and much more athletic than George Zimmerman was, and was pissed off, he probably decided to take on this guy for ethnically profiling him, for giving him a hard time, for making a pleasant walk through the neighborhood into a nightmare. There are two sides to this. And yes, a man was killed, and yes, that's wrong. But ultimately, who was responsible for killing that man? It was a two-sided issue. It was partly that, I'm going to say something that will get me lynched, that the rate of crime among black youth is far higher than it is among white youth. Yes, some of that higher crime rate comes from the fact that authorities pin things on black kids more than they pin things on white kids. That authorities let white kids go, think it's just hooliganism, manage to excuse the activities of white kids more than they do for black kids. That is a real problem. That's a problem of racism. But there is more violence in black neighborhoods. There is more violence from black kids, which means that the difficulties taking place, the robberies taking place in George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin's father's fiance's neighborhood, were coming in large part from black kids. But the real problems here, well, problem number one is we should all be able to, we have to shed our racism. We have to shed our ideological prejudices when we're looking at the situation of a George Zimmerman. One man is dead. There's nothing you can do to bring him back. You can torture George Zimmerman all you want. You can put him to death as many times as you want. That is not going to bring Trayvon Martin back. You have one person who's alive. And the big question is, how do you treat him? Is he guilty of murder? Or is he guilty of self-defense? In either case, he's guilty of killing someone. But in self-defense, we let you go. Who's really guilty here? There's a group on the right that writes legislation, model legislation, and peddles it all over the country. You've heard about this. One piece of legislation they were peddling was a stand your ground piece of legislation. It was a piece of legislation that reveled in your so-called right to own a firearm. So-called because the Constitution only gives you the right to a well-regulated militia. Let's repeat one of those words. Regulated. A word that is anathema, poison to the people who claim that they speak on behalf of the Second Amendment freedom to carry an arm. There is no such thing as the Second Amendment individual freedom to carry a weapon. That is a lie. And that lie was promulgated in the state of Florida along with a certain exultant exuberance about the idea that the only thing that stops a bad man with a gun is a good man with a gun, and thus all good men, meaning white people, should have guns. And they should have the right to shoot black people because black people are bad men. That is the attitude that was being peddled by an organization that is supported by a huge percentage of Republican congressmen and senators and 300 corporations. And it was shoved down the throats of Floridians. And it was in the wake of that exuberance that the George Zimmerman. Sorry, I'm getting my Martins and my Zimmermans all confused. But the George Zimmerman thing took place. And there was exultance in Florida over the right of a more or less white man to shoot a black man in what seemed to be self-defense. It was back to the days of lynching. Doesn't that feel good? It was wretched. The real killers of Trayvon Martin are the National Rifle Association and the organization that is peddling laws that exult in one person's freedom to kill another with a gun all over the United States. If you want to put somebody in jail, take the senators, the congressmen, and the 300 corporations that put the self-defense laws in Florida on the books. Take the people in the National Rifle Association and their supporters, put them in jail for killing Trayvon Martin. No gun, Trayvon Martin would still be alive today. George Zimmerman might not.